Many years ago, I made a video on the history of hunter stings, from vanilla WoW all the way up till Mista Pandaria. Since then, a few expansions have gone by, and I have a better microphone, so I thought it was time to update the video because the old one is unwatchable. Hunters have had 6 stings in their lifetime. First off, we've got Serpent Sting, the most used sting of all the hunter stings. In its first form, Serpent Sting was just a standard dot. It did a little bit of nature damage over 15 seconds. Strangely enough, it also scaled with spell power. Hunters did not use spell power, so Serpent Sting did not do very much damage in vanilla. In a raid setting, it was almost never used because bosses had debuff limits, and you really didn't want to waste one of your few debuff slots on this crappy dot. Hunters could also only use one sting on a target at a time. So hunters had to choose to use this crappy dot or one of the other stings, which I'll talk about in a bit, and spoiler alert, the other ones kinda suck too. Then in the Burning Crusade, Blizzard finally let Serpent Sting scale with attack power and not spell power. But it still wasn't really used in raiding because also in the Burning Crusade, the best DPS rotation could be macroed into one button. And that macro didn't have room for Serpent Sting, nor did it need its mediocre damage. So it was mainly just used as the go-to sting while questing, doing dungeons, or to keep a rogue from going in stealth in PvP. Serpent Sting did finally start to see wide use in Wrath. By this time, the debuff limit on bosses was either gone or made so big that it was impossible to reach. And it had very good buffs for survival and marksman hunters. For survival hunters, you had a talent that increased all the damage you did to targets with Serpent Sting on it, which made it a must-use. And marksman hunters had Chimera Shot interactions. Chimera Shot was the signature shot of marksman hunters at this time, and it did a lot of upfront damage, refreshed the duration of whatever sting was on the target, and did a little extra effect depending on what sting was refreshed. Serpent Sting's bonus effect was just more damage. I think it did something like 40% of the total dot damage as the bonus damage, but it might have been changed throughout the expansion. Whatever the case, it was the go-to sting for raiding, and pretty much everything else. For BM, I think they just used it as a normal dot or something. BM was the worst spec in Wrath, so no one really played it. You see, BM was the go-to spec for the Burning Crusade, so they nerfed it into the ground for Wrath of the Lich King so that hunters would play the other 2 specs. Then in Cataclysm, Serpent Sting saw one of its biggest changes yet. Survival hunters were given 2 new talents that had a big effect on Serpent Sting. The first being a talent that allowed Serpent Sting to do 30% of its total damage up front upon application as bonus damage, and a talent that let multi-shot apply Serpent Sting to all targets hit, but at a reduced duration. The 30% upfront bonus damage was also applied through multi-shot, giving survival hunters some of the best AoE in the game. This would be top tier AoE damage even today, but also in Cataclysm, there were other classes with even more overpowered AoE, and the most overpowered AoE in the game's history: Combustion Spread Fire Mages. Cataclysm was the golden age of high AoE damage, and I don't think any expansion has come close to it since. And hunters were part of that history with Serpent Spread Multi-Shot. Then later on, its upfront damage was nerfed to 15% and then removed in Warlords. It was also made a survival-only ability and could only be applied through multi-shot or arcane shot. Then in Legion, with survival hunters changed into a melee spec, Serpent Sting was just changed to be applied by their new AoE abilities as a talent you can take. Scorpion Sting was one of the other original stings hunters had in vanilla. In its first form, it was basically just a poison debuff that would lower the target's agility and strength by a fixed amount. In the Burning Crusade, it was changed to a hit chance reduction, which lowered physical hit chance by 5%, and then 3% in Wrath. Scorpion Sting was probably the least used of the original stings, but it did have some uses outside of its intended effects. You see, since targets could only have one of your stings on them at a time, if you needed to clear your Serpent Sting dot to CC something, you could just use Scorpion Sting to replace the dot instead of waiting for your Serpent Sting dot to run out, as Scorpion Sting did no damage. Also in Wrath, Scorpion Sting's interaction with Chimera Shot was extremely useful in PvP. You see, if you hit a target with Chimera Shot while Scorpion Sting was up, they would be disarmed for 10 seconds. The disarm effect didn't work on ranged weapons though, so doing it to another hunter wasn't really worth it. This disarm interaction had a 1-minute internal cooldown though, so you couldn't just keep disarming someone over and over. So most hunters would only apply Scorpion Sting long enough to disarm them, and then switch back to Serpent Sting for damage since the debuff effect wasn't very good. Come Cataclysm and Scorpion Sting just got removed from the game. No real loss there, hunters rarely used it anyway. Then come Legion, and Scorpion Sting is re-added back to the game 3 expansions later as a PvP talent. In its first form for Legion, it worked a lot like you were actually poisoning your weapon, as you had to activate the ability, and then the next ability you did would apply its effect. Its effect was to reduce the target's physical crit chance by 50% for 6 seconds, which is enough to basically make whoever it's hit by not be able to crit for its full duration. Then later on in Legion, it was changed to just an active ability, and its cooldown lowered to 24 seconds, and the duration increased to 8 seconds. Next up, we've got Viper Sting. Viper Sting, while not as used as Serpent Sting, was still probably the second most used Sting, as it was pretty much just a straight up mana drain. Also, funny enough, even though Viper Sting didn't do any damage and just drained mana, its ticks, which drained mana, would break CC like a normal dot. In Viper Sting's first form, it just drained a fixed amount of mana over 8 seconds and had no cooldown. A little later on, it was given a 15-second cooldown, and then in Wrath, it was changed to drain a percentage of the target's maximum mana, and then give the mana drain to the hunter times 3, actually making it semi-useful ability in some boss fights, if the boss used mana to get some of your mana back, since before Cataclysm, hunters used mana, and ran out pretty frequently. But its main use has always been in PvP to try and drain healers. Even if it only drained 4% of their mana, that could really add up over a fight. It was also so good that it was common practice for hunters to try and mask Viper Sting with a Scorpion Pet and Snake Trap to prevent it from being dispelled. Since back in the day, healers didn't have a cooldown on their dispels baseline, but their dispels would only remove one thing at a time, and it would remove a debuff at random. And the Scorpion Pet at the time had a special ability to put a poison dot up, which would stack 5 times. Because also back then, pets all had different special abilities based on what family they belonged to. And Snake Trap was this trap that hunters had back then, which would release a bunch of snakes that shot 3 poisons at enemies. One of them being a dot that stacked 5 times, just like the Scorpion's dot. In addition to a slow and hasty buff. Man, a lot of these things aren't in the game anymore. Anyways, hunters thought Viper Sting was good enough to spam poisons on healers so they couldn't dispel it and slowly drain their mana away. Drain teams aren't a thing anymore, ever since Blizzard removed all mana drain abilities from classes, but hunters were one of like 3 classes that could drain mana. Viper Sting also had a special interaction with Chimera Shot. If refreshed through Chimera Shot, it would give you mana equal to 60% of what it had drained. Out of all of the Chimera Shot effects, Viper Sting was probably the least useful. But the fact that Chimera Shot would refresh the duration of the Sting meant it was absolutely used on Viper Sting. Since the Sting only lasted 8 seconds and had a 15-second cooldown, you couldn't keep it up full time. But with Chimera Shot refresh, it was possible to keep it up long enough for its cooldown to refresh if you timed it right. But even with Chimera Shot refreshes, you couldn't keep it up 100% since Chimera Shot also had like a 10 or so second cooldown. So it would eventually fall off, but not as often with Chimera Shot. Then in Cataclysm, Viper Sting was removed from the game, along with all other mana drain effects. And that was it for the spell, until 3 expansions later when it was brought back as a PvP talent in Legion. In its first Legion form, it worked like Scorpion Sting, and that you had to activate the ability first, and then it would be applied with your next attack. Viper Sting no longer drains mana though. Instead what it does is put a healing debuff on the target that reduces healing by 30% for 6 seconds, but can be removed if the target casts a non-instant cast healing spell. So as long as you don't cast it on a healer, you don't have to worry about it being removed by its own effect. All on a 30-second cooldown, which was lowered from 45 seconds in patch 7.1.5. Next up, we've got Widow Venom. Now, this one never had Sting in its name, but it functioned and looked so much like a Sting that it's basically one. For one, it was a poison debuff, had the image of a poisoned arrowhead in its picture, and was added right after 2 stings were removed, basically as a replacement. What Widow Venom did was reduce the target's healing taken for like 30 seconds. The amount it lowered the healing by changed expansion to expansion, but it spent most of its life reducing healing by 25%. Now, this ability didn't have a cooldown and lasted for half a minute, making it like a super version of today's Viper Sting, which only lasts 6 seconds and has a 30-second cooldown, and can be removed if the target casts a heal. And it was mainly just a staple ability used in PvP, as most classes had some kind of healing reduction similar, so it wasn't really special. The ability was removed from the game in Warlords of Draenor, and Viper Sting came back to the game with basically its effect, and even uses its spell icon for Legion, so it probably won't be added back. Waven Sting was also kind of one of the original stings, since it was added in vanilla as well, but not until later on in the expansion. Waven Sting was the last talent choice for survival hunters to replace Lacerate, a melee dot that was infamous for being one of the worst abilities in the game. In Waven Sting's first form, it was a CC which put the target to sleep for 12 seconds, and then after the sleep effect ended, would put a dot on the target for another 12 seconds. Being an instant cast ranged CC, it was actually pretty useful. It's just too bad it was the last talent choice for a terrible spec. In the Burning Crusade, Waven Sting was changed to only put the target to sleep for 10 seconds in PvP, along with all other CCs that had durations longer than 10 seconds. Then in Wrath, it was changed so that its baseline sleep duration was 30 seconds, and its dot only lasted 6 seconds after they woke up. Obviously, it still only lasted 10 seconds of PvP, but this was a nice buff to its PvE uses as an extra CC for hunters. The big problem with Waven Sting, though, as a CC, was the dot it put on the target after the CC ended. Luckily, Waven Sting was technically a sting. You could just put up a Scorpion Sting at the tail end of the duration, or after it ended to avoid the target from taking dot damage, so that you could just layer on another CC. Later on in Wrath, Waven Sting was lowered to only last 6 seconds in PvP, and to share diminishing returns with Freezing Trap, since hunters were a little too good at CC, having Scattershot, Freezing Arrow, and Waven Sting all being instant cast, while other classes with similar CC abilities had to cast their spells, giving the opponent an opportunity to counterplay them. Then in Cataclysm, hunters were given a new ability called Cobra Shot, which generated focus and increased the duration of the serpent sting on the target by about 6 seconds or so per cast. So the hunter specs who actually used this ability spammed it. It was supposed to be a way for hunters to not have to continuously reapply their dot throughout the fight. But for a while in Cataclysm, it actually worked on Waven Sting's 6-second dot as well, despite Cobra Shot not saying it should work on it. It wasn't really a big deal though, and it was fixed shortly after. In Mist of Pandaria, its dot damage after the sleep was removed, and it was made a talent that all 3 hunter specs could choose. Then, aside from a few minor changes, nothing big happened to the ability until Warlords of Draenor, when it was given a 1.5 second cast time. Blizzard just really doesn't like a class to have too many instant cast CCs. Then in Legion, it was removed as an option for survival hunters since they went full melee, which is funny since it was originally given to hunters in vanilla when Blizzard decided to move away from melee survival hunters. And now it's just a talent marksman and BM hunters can take. And last but not least, we've got Spider Sting. Spider Sting is the newest sting added to the hunter arsenal, being added with Legion as a PvP talent. What it did in its first form was to put a debuff on the target that, after 5 seconds, if the target casted an offensive spell, would silence them for 4 seconds. A really good ticking time bomb spell to shut down casters, as they are forced to only use defensive abilities for the duration, or risk a silence. But not as useful against most healers, who you'd normally save a silence for in PvP. In patch 7.1.5, it had its cooldown lowered to 45 seconds from 60, and its duration lowered from 5 seconds to 4, but the silence duration stayed the same. So now casters only have to wait 4 seconds for it to fall off instead of 5, which makes sense as it matches up with the penalty silence and its duration now. And for the most part, that's it for the history of stings. Ever since I last made this video back in Mist of Pandaria, nearly all of the stings were re-added back to the game, and we even got a new one since then. If you want to watch the old garbage version of this video, I'll link at the end of this one.